I have today ordered to Vietnam the Air Mobile Division and certain other forces which will raise our fighting strength from 75,000 to 125,000 men almost immediately.
The Vietnam War, a Cold War-era proxy that spanned just shy of 20 years, is widely regarded as one of the most violent and unjust wars in American history. This permanent stain on American social and political consciousness was widely protested by many different organizations both within the United States and abroad. From pacifists to politicians, few were shy to speak out against the atrocities inflicted against the people of Vietnam. However, not many were willing to take action against it. There were some, however, who band together under a political consciousness and despite a lack of organization or funding, were able to enact real political change. These were the hippies, whose mantra of peace, free love, and social equality rang throughout the youth of the nation. The archetypal image of long-haired men smoking in circles or braless women dancing in the park are present in the minds of even the youngest generations, due largely in part to their presence in the media. While the hippies had saturated the culture of the 60s and 70s, they had failed to enact major social change until the late 1960s, when a radicalized group of hippies led by Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, who vowed to march against the Vietnam War outside of the Democratic National Convention, held in Chicago in 1968. This group, who gave themselves the name the Yippies, displayed a different side of the hippie, typically considered dropouts not dedicated enough to fight for real change. While the march was intended to be a peaceful demonstration, Chicago police, instructed by Mayor Richard Daley, raided the hippies' camps and brought about a violent end to the march, resulting in hundreds of reported injuries and 8 major arrests. Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, and 6 other radical anti-war protesters, including Black Panther co-founder Bobby Seale, were charged with inciting a riot, along with countless other minor charges, and were eventually tried a year later. Both the original protests and the subsequent trial were covered extensively in the media, providing one instance of a historical precedence for many of today's network-connected popular protests. Chicago 10 tells the story of the famous protests held in Chicago in August of 1968. From the planning of the demonstrations in New York to the eventual arrival of the protesters in the park for what was deemed the Festival of Life, to the trial of 8 demonstrators who were used as scapegoats to place blame for the entire operation. The film places specific emphasis on the trial, adapting court transcripts along with witness and jury interviews to prompt the viewer towards a more complete understanding of the events. Released in 2007 by director Brett Morgen, Chicago 10 uses a combination of archival footage and stop-motion animation to juxtapose the public display of police brutality over the course of 3 days with the political farce that was the subsequent trial of the 8 protesters that spanned many months. The name Chicago 10 comes from the 8 protesters as well as their 2 defense lawyers that were charged with contempt of the court. Morgan's choice in creating a docudrama aligned the viewer with the plight of the Yippies, whose aim as a non-hierarchical, non-violent radical group was to expose the current system as an organized political theater, which valued showmanship and asserting a point over actual substantiated change. The Yippies believed that once the current system was exposed, it could be undermined, and the public would be more open to the understanding that politics did not simply occur in isolated trials or on the campaign trail, but rather that politics were the images you saw every day and the ways you lived your life. By intercutting scenes of militarized riot training camps and clips of Walter Cronkite, who was deemed the most trusted man in America, explaining that the Democratic National Convention would begin in a police state, with bright animation depicting the defendants entering the courtroom dressed in judicial robes and police uniforms, Morgen is both providing the context necessary to stage the events and taking the story outside of its context, allowing it to be applicable to a larger audience and varying social issues. Although Chicago 10 does not present a radically different narrative than those usually put forth in hippie versus police films, the form it takes allows it to contribute something different. The use of animation in the documentary form has become popularized in recent years, as video effects and digital manipulation have permeated most visual arts. By choosing to create a semi-animated docudrama, substituting the usual formula of archival footage and talking heads with more point-of-view, pseudo-verite narrative work, Morgen takes the audience out of the historical timeline and into the individual experiences of the defendants. For example, by assuming the point of view of the kiss that Abbie Hoffman blows to the jury, zooming through the courtroom, whizzing by the prosecutor's ear to hit the oldest, whitest jury member in the cheek, or bringing the viewer into a tight frame of Bobby Seale's embarrassed, exasperated face as he is brought out into the courtroom, gagged and bound to the chair. Morgan breaks the normal documentary form and puts the viewer in the eyes of the defendants, thereby further aligning the audience with their plight. Chicago 10 covers an incredibly contentious time, and in particular, a very violent incident in recent American history, and the semi-animated form also lends itself to covering these kinds of issues. Another animated docudrama that covers a contentious historical event is Waltz with Bashir. Directed by and starring Israeli filmmaker Ari Folman, Waltz with Bashir follows the filmmaker's journey into his own past, as he interviews his friends, family, and colleagues in an attempt to uncover his own memories surrounding his time fighting in the war in Lebanon in 1982. Like Chicago 10, Waltz with Bashir uses the animated documentary form as a means to remove the severity of the events in question, as well as distancing the action of the true horrors of the period, in the hopes of creating a space to discuss contended issues such as militarized police brutality, mismanaged political systems, and perpetrators' guilt. Chicago 10 rarely shows archival footage of police aggression, choosing to substitute news coverage of protesters' heads being beaten with bully clubs for stop-motion animated reenactments, only bringing the viewer back into the actual events after the violence, with images of bodies being carried away by comrades and blood in the streets. The universal question in showing violent images, whether journalistic or documentarian, is whether or not the violence attracts viewers for the wrong reasons. If relaying the violence to a larger audience removes the merit from the reporting, turning the event into the type of pornographic treatment of tragedy. The choice to use animation removes the pure shock value of the recorded events, as well as diminishes the archetypal image of a hippie, think long hair, bell-bottoms, and a peace necklace, viewer's mind, allowing their struggles and persistence against failing democratic systems and unjustified police brutality to translate into a larger audience, transcending the period of the 1960s. The violence that occurred at the Democratic National Convention in 1968 had a major impact on the nonviolent anti-war movement in America. These events marked the first time that the hippies were radicalized into action, and the brutality they faced in Chicago and the media coverage it garnered both made hippies more committed to their beliefs, as well as increased popular sympathy towards their goal of ending the war in Vietnam. In an interview with the New York Daily News, Brett Morgen stated that he, quote, wanted to hopefully inspire this generation, or at least show them an example of young people who were so committed to their cause that they were willing to go into an ambush to get their point across. Chicago 10 was released in 2007, and since then, there has been a major increase in popular activism, due largely in part to developments in technology and the rise of more liberal news sources committed to empowering citizens. Massively organized protests, such as those of the Arab Spring, documented in the film The Square, the popular movement protesting the mismanaged economy in Spain, depicted in 15M, and the international protests in response to racism and white on people of color violence sparked by the death of Michael Brown Jr. in Ferguson, Missouri, have used similar methods as the Yippies in Chicago 10. Each movement rallied disparate groups of individuals in a populist, non-hierarchical manner to protest unjust governments and persevered in the face of true danger towards their goals. While I cannot make the claim that films such as Chicago 10 are to be credited for any of these actions, it is important to note that the aim of the film, to rally individuals to fight for their beliefs, has in fact come to pass.